under the blood-rind skies of Veltrax's prime. The final battle of the long Hume-Sauron War had begun, and Captain Jonas Vierick stood on the command deck of the S Resolute, eyes locked on the jagged black mountains that pierced the clouds. Like claws, somewhere behind them lay the obsidian citadel, the rumored seat of the Sauron Queen, a place no human had ever seen and lived to describe, a place wrapped in legend and shadows, where the enemy's leader in scene, Khajd, had directed war efforts with cold, precise cruelty for over a decade, and Jonas, scarred by loss and duty, had vowed to end her reign no matter the cost. Orbital cannons lit the horizon in white fire as drop pods rained down like iron hail, sending shock waves through the broken plains below, where the last Sauron defenders, twisted, coral blue armor and living rifles, fought with desperate ferocity. But the human soldiers were relentless, fighting with grim resolve, driven by years of bloodshed and the hope that this, finally, was the last stand. And as Jonas descended in his command pod, he thought not of glory, but of silence, what it might feel like to finally stop hearing the war reports, to close his eyes and not see names of the dead. But Veltraxus welcomed him with thunder and smoke, the ground trembling beneath as the pod doors blasted open and Jonas led his strike team through the ruins of a city fused with alien biotechnology. The walls breathing faintly, veins of glowing blue pulsing underfoot, giving the unsettling sense that the whole city was alive and watching, the air thick with tension and the ever-present whine of plasma fire echoing from distant alleys. But their objective was clear: the central tower, the citadel itself, where intel said the queen remained despite the collapse of her empire. And, as they pushed forward, encountering strange resistance guards who seemed more like puppets than soldiers, whispering in languages no translator could catch, Jonas couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, that this wasn't a final stand, but something else, something older and colder than war, a feeling that intensified as they reached the base of the citadel, its black walls humming with low resonance, almost like a voice murmuring just out of hearing. And inside, the halls were vast and empty, lit by floating orbs that adjusted as they moved, until all his teams, equipment, radios, weapons, HUDs, flickered with static and then died, leaving them in an unnatural silence that made their boots on the glassy floors sound like hammer blows. And when they came to the great doors, at the heart of the citadel's smooth, silver-black metal that shimmered with shifting patterns, Jonas ordered his team to stay back, unsure why, only knowing he had to be the one to open them. And when he placed his hand on the surface, the doors opened without force, unfolding like petals to reveal a single, vast chamber, circular, its ceiling lost in shadow, and in the center stood a lone figure, clad in armor unlike any the Sauron had used. Tall, regal, motionless hand. Jonas stepped forward, hand on his sidearm, his voice low as he demanded her surrender, expecting resistance, expecting treachery. But instead, the figure slowly raised both hands in a gesture of peace, then lifted the helmet and removed it, revealing a face that stunned him into stillness, not monstrous, not alien in the way he'd been taught to expect, but eerily, hauntingly familiar, with features that mirrored human form almost perfectly, save for her luminous silver eyes and the faint glow under her skin, a strange beauty that clashed violently with everything he had believed about the Sauron. Huh? And before he could speak, she said his name, Jonason, perfect Terran standard, her voice soft and full of something he couldn't name. And as he stood there, every instinct told him to raise his weapon, to finish the war right then. But something in her expression, in the calm and sadness behind those alien eyes, held him in place as she said, "You've come to kill a monster. But what if I am not what you think?" And in that moment, everything Jonas had known about the enemy, about the war, about himself, began to unravel. As the alien queen, unarmed and alone, stepped forward, not to fight, but to speak. Captain Jonas Varick stood frozen inside the silent throne chamber, still gripping his sidearm, staring at the strange yet beautiful face of the Zalran queen who had just removed her helmet, revealing silver eyes that seemed to shimmer like starlight and a calm expression that didn't match any image he had ever seen of the enemy leader. His orders had been clear: capture or kill. But now, faced with a living myth standing barely a few feet away, unarmed and unmoving, Jonas found himself caught between instinct and confusion, unsure what was real anymore, because she looked nothing like the monster he had expected, and her words still echoed in his mind. "You've come to kill a monster, but what if I am not what you think?" It wasn't just the way she spoke, Terran standard perfectly, or the strange human-like shape of her face, but the way she looked at him. Not with hatred or arrogance, but with a quiet, unreadable sadness, like someone who had seen too much. And when Jonas finally stepped forward, weapon half lowered, he asked her who she really was, and she answered with a name that sounded both alien and graceful: Survival. Last sovereign of the Zalran, but more than a title. She said she was the only one left who knew the truth of the war, the truth no one on either side wanted to believe. And as the walls of the chamber pulsed with that strange, low energy, and the rest of Jonas's team waited nervously beyond the great doors, he chose, for reasons he couldn't explain, to hear her out, watching as she raised one pale blue hand and touched the air between them, causing the air to shimmer and ripple like water, forming a glowing thread of light that hovered between their eyes. And she told him it was safe, that it was called the Mind Stream, a way her people shared memory directly, not with words, but with feeling and experience, and that she would show him something important, not to deceive him, but to give him a choice. And though every part of his training screamed that this was a trap, something in her voice, calm and honest, convinced him to take the risk. And when he gave the smallest nod, she stepped closer and touched her fingers to his temple, and instantly Jonas was no longer in the chamber, but inside a vision, surrounded by stars, endless, dark ocean full of dying systems, planets going silent, fleets disintegrating without warning. And then came a terrible feeling, like coldness swallowing everything, and in the distance, a shape of pure blackness moving between galaxies like a storm. And Sarai's voice was inside his mind, not speaking, but showing the Voran silence, a force older than the war, older than either species, something that did not conquer or destroy, but erased, wiping entire civilizations as if they had never existed. And she showed him how the Zalran first discovered the threat centuries ago, how they began preparing, adapting, and how the first contact with humans had been a mistake, a misunderstanding that led to battle, then hatred, then war, until both sides were too deep in blood to stop. And Jonas saw flashes of her own life, young, hopeful, speaking at councils, begging for peace, failing, then rising to power in a time of fear, forced to make impossible choices. And suddenly, the vision ended, and he was back in the throne room, breathing hard, hands shaking, sweat on his forehead, because it had felt real, too real. And for a moment, he forgot he was standing before an alien queen who was supposed to be his enemy, because now she was just Sarai, a leader who had tried to save her people and failed. And Jonas asked her why she was showing him this now, and she replied softly that she was tired of hiding, that with her empire crumbling and the Voran drawing near, she had to try one last time to make someone listen. And she believed he might be the one to understand. But even as she spoke, alarms began to sound in Jonas's earpiece. His squad had picked up movement, reinforcements approaching, orders from high command, demanding extraction and immediate transfer of the queen for questioning and likely execution. And Jonas found himself torn between everything he'd ever believed and what he had just seen, wondering if it was all a trick, a psychic illusion to make him hesitate. or if it was the truth he had never been told. And HFY stood still, watching him with those strange silver eyes, saying nothing more, letting him decide. And Jonas didn't know what to believe anymore, but he knew one thing: he had never seen a Zauran soldier look at him without hate. Never felt anything like what he felt now. A strange, dangerous trust forming in the quiet space between them. And as the chamber doors opened behind him, and his team rushed in with weapons drawn, yelling for him to step back, Jonas did something no one expected. He raised a hand and told them to lower their weapons, 'cause the queen had surrendered. Yes, but more than that. He believed she had something the war council needed to hear, and though his team looked at him like he'd lost his mind, they obeyed. And HFY slowly placed her helmet back on her head, eyes never leaving Jonas's face as she was led away, in restraints that she didn't resist, her voice silent now, but her message echoing in his mind. As the throne room faded behind them and the war outside paused for a moment, not in victory, but in confusion, in questions yet unanswered. And Jonas Virik, once a soldier who only saw enemies, now carried the memory of something far greater than war. And he didn't know what the truth would cost him, only that he had to find it. Inside the dimly lit brig of the S Resolute, Captain Jonas Virik stood with his arms crossed, eyes fixed on the transparent energy barrier that separated him from the Zauran queen. HFY, who sat calmly on the bench inside the cell with her hands resting in her lap, her expression unreadable, as if she had expected to end up here all along. And even though she wore a prisoner's uniform now, and not her strange alien armor, she held herself like a queen still, her posture unshaken, her silver eyes watchful. And Jonas found himself wondering how someone so still, so silent, could be the same leader who had commanded fleets, who had been the ghost at the heart of the war, the one they'd all feared. And yet, he also remembered what he'd seen in the mind-stream visions that felt more like memories than dreams. Flashes of ancient galaxies, dead worlds, and a darkness that had chilled him to the core. And it was that memory, that whisper of truth, that had kept him awake at night since the drop mission ended, wondering if he was being fooled or if everything he had ever believed was a lie. Because the war had been simple, once humans on one side, monsters on the other, but now it was full of shadows and doubt. And so he returned again and again to the cell, not just out of duty, but something else he couldn't name, something that tugged at his thoughts even when he tried to ignore it. And this time, when he stepped into the observation room, HFY looked up at him and said, "You're ready." And Jonas didn't ask how she knew what he'd come for, didn't try to deny it, because deep down he needed answers. And she told him the first step to understanding was trust. Then ask him again to link with her through the mind stream, just for a few minutes, just one more memory. And though every regulation said not to, though every instinct screamed that getting too close to the enemy was dangerous, Jonas nodded. And the guard stepped back as the energy field dropped. And HFY reached out her hand slowly, giving him time to change his mind, but he didn't. In the moment her fingertips brushed his skin, the world around them disappeared, replaced by a soft white light, then a sharp cold wind. And suddenly Jonas was no longer in the brig, standing on a wide icy plain under a red sky, looking out across a shattered city made of tall crystal spires, their tops broken and blackened, smoke rising in slow spirals. And in the sky above, shapes moved, enormous black forms that made no sound. And HFY stood beside him now, her voice quiet in his mind as she explained that this was the fall of a Zauran colony 200 years ago, the first contact with a Voran silence who had come without warning, without demands, who simply arrived, consumed, and vanished, leaving no survivors. And Jonas felt it. He didn't just see the memory, he lived it. Felt the fear of the Zauran citizens, as their sky turned dark. The helplessness of soldiers firing weapons that did nothing. The horror of realizing the enemy wasn't here to fight, only to end. And when the vision ended, Jonas stumbled back, breath shaking, skin cold, eyes wide as Sarai gently pulled her hand away. "Okay," and he realized tears had formed in the corners of his eyes, not from pain, but from a deep, raw feeling of loss that hadn't been his, but now lived in him anyway. And Sarai said nothing for a long time, letting him breathe, then told him that the Vorin had already begun moving again. That Earth was on the edge of their path, and that the Zaurin had built weapons, not for conquest, but to delay the inevitable. And Jonas began to understand why the war had started the way it did, not out of hatred, but out of fear, miscommunication, and desperation, because the Zaurin had seen too much to trust another species, and the humans had never known what truly lay in the void. And over the next few days, Jonas returned to the cell again and again, each time linking with Sarai, each time seeing more pieces of her life, her rise to leadership after her mother's death in battle, her failed peace talks with early human diplomats, her council torn apart by fear and pride, and each time Jonas felt the line between them blur a little more, not human and alien, not soldier and prisoner, but the people bound by duty and haunted by loss. And the more he saw, the more he began to question everything the Earth Coalition had told him. Tarian, everything he believed about the Zaurin. Cause Sarai wasn't just a queen, she was a person who had made impossible choices, and those memories shared through the mind stream had never felt like lies. And yet Jonas also knew that no one in command would believe what he had seen. Not without proof, and time was running out, because Sarai's execution order had already been signed by the High Council and was scheduled for the end of the week. And Jonas found himself pacing his quarters late at night, torn between loyalty to his people and the truth that had taken root in his heart. And part of him hated how his thoughts kept drifting to her, not just as a leader or a warning, but as someone whose quiet strength had begun to change him, even if he couldn't admit it out loud. And when he finally confronted Admiral Lara Sol, his longtime friend and superior, and told her about the mind stream, about what he had seen, about the Vorin, she didn't call him crazy, but she didn't believe him either. And that was worse, because she said softly that war changes people, that guilt and loss can twist memories, and that maybe the Queen was using him. And Jonas wanted to argue, wanted to fight for what he knew was real, but he could already see the decision in her eyes, the same one written into the execution order. And so, on the night before Sarai was to be transferred off the ship, Jonas stood outside her cell one last time, unsure of what to say. But she spoke first, saying only, "You know the truth now, don't you?" And he nodded, because he did. And then she said, "They won't listen." And he replied, "No, they won't." And for a long time, neither of them spoke, till Jonas made his decision, one that would end his career, maybe his life, but one he knew he had to make, because he couldn't let the only voice that knew the true threat be silenced. And as alarms later rang through the ship, and the guards scrambled to locate the missing prisoner, no one could have predicted that Captain Jonas Varick, the war hero, had stolen a stealth ship and vanished into deep space with the enemy queen, not to escape justice, but to find it. Out in the dark places where the stars were starting to disappear, the stolen stealth ship drifted through the cold, silent dark of uncharted space, its lights dimmed, its engines quiet, as if afraid to wake something ancient hiding in the black beyond the stars. And inside the cockpit, Captain Jonas Varick sat in silence, hands steady on the controls, while Saravel stood beside him, her silver eyes watching the star map flicker with faint pulses of unknown signals, some moving, some vanishing like ghostly echoes of dying worlds. And neither of them spoke for a long time, because they both felt The way the dark felt heavier here, like the stars themselves were holding their breath. In this region, the red expanse had been marked on human charts as a dead zone, a place of signal loss and unexplained disappearances, but for the Zauren, it was something far worse. And Sirai finally whispered that they were close now, that soon Jonas would see the Vorin for himself, and Jonas, who had survived 100 battles and lost half his team in the siege of Veltrax's Prime, felt something he hadn't felt in years of fear. Not of death, but of not understanding what was coming, because he had left behind everything for this mission, his rank, his ship, his crew, his name even, whispered as a traitor across the Earth Coalition's secure channels. Yet, he had no regrets, only questions that clawed at him in the quiet hours. And now, as the ship neared the first target system, a place once called Celis 9, marked lost 80 years, Ghost Rai told him to watch the long-range scans. And when he did, he saw it, not at first, not with his eyes, but with the ship's sensors in absence, a place where light bent and vanished, where signals entered and didn't return, like a wound in space itself, a slow-moving void the size of a moon, leaving behind a dead star and a planet stripped clean. And Jonas whispered, "Is that one of them?" Sirai nodded slowly, explaining that it was not a ship, not a creature, but a phenomenon, a force that consumed not with heat or hunger, but with silence, erased things, tore them from time and memory. And the Vorin did not speak, did not warn, did not stop, and as they observed from a safe distance, hiding behind the shadow of a dead asteroid field, Jonas watched as a faint glimmer of light blinked in and out within the void, like stars dying, and even the stealth ship's shielding began to strain under the pressure of simply observing it. And Sarai explained that the Vorin were drawn to noise energy bursts, communication signals, even thoughts, and the Zauren had learned to go silent, to hide, to erase themselves from the galaxy, to delay discovery, and that was why she had come to Veltraxis to end the war, because soon the Vorin would hear the noise humans made, or expanding colonies, their endless signals, and follow the sound like sharks to blood. And Jonas sat back, the horror sinking in, not just because of what the Vorin could do, but because no one would believe him, not without proof. Not when he was a deserter and a criminal now. And so he asked her, "How do we show them?" And Sirai looked down, her voice low as she said, "We don't. We bring it to them." And Jonas turned slowly to her, realizing what she meant, that the only way to prove the Vorin were real was to get close enough to be followed, to lure the silence to a place where the Coalition would see it with their own eyes. And even as his mind reeled at the risk, he knew she was right, because time was short. And the Viren's path had shifted. They were already moving toward human space, just slowly enough for no one to notice. And so they jumped again, this time toward a hidden Zauren outpost on the edge of a burnt system called Imari's Reach, where a small team of surviving scientists had kept watch, running silent probes for decades. And when they arrived, the station was still active, but its crew wary, speaking in low tones and watching Jonas with hard eyes until Sarai spoke to them in the old tongue, sharing her presence through the mind stream. And they finally allowed him access to the data vault, where Jonas saw the truth, laid bare star maps, movement patterns, system collapses, timelines far older than any Earth database had tracked, and more terrifying than anything he'd imagined. Because the Vorin didn't just destroy, they erased records, left nothing behind, made it impossible to know where they had been. And Jonas realized that only the Zauren memory sharing had preserved the knowledge, passed down from mind to mind like an ember in the dark. And he suddenly understood why Sarai had taken the risk to trust him, why she had shown him her thoughts, because now he carried that ember too. And if he died, part of that truth might survive. And as they planned their next move, The station's warning systems activated. One of the listening probes had gone silent. Then another, then a third, all in a straight line. And Sarai's face went pale as she whispered that the Vorin had heard them. And they had to run, not to escape, but to guide the threat toward a place where humans would see it, where they couldn't deny it. And Jonas knew what she meant. Earth, the heart of the coalition, would never believe until the darkness was at their doorstep. And so, against every instinct he had as a soldier, he changed the ship's course, set a trail of low-frequency pulses, subtle enough to be noticed, dangerous enough to attract attention. And with the Varan's faint signal growing stronger behind them, they jumped toward the Sol system, carrying not just a warning, but the storm itself. And Jonas knew that even if they failed, even if Earth turned on them or the Vorin destroyed everything, someone had to try. Someone had to stop the silence before it reached all living stars. And as the black shape began to pulse behind them, a slow and patient shadow in pursuit, he gripped the controls and said to Sarai, "Let's make them listen." The stars raced past a small stealth ship as it tore through jump space, a thin hum vibrating through the hull, and Captain Jonas Virik sat tense in the pilot seat, eyes fixed on the countdown to Sol, knowing that each second brought them closer to Earth and closer to destruction, because behind them, the Vorin followed like a silent ghost, invisible to most sensors, but felt in the air like pressure on the Sol. And Ciravel stood beside him, arms crossed, her face still and unreadable, though Jonas had come to know the small signs in her expressions, the tiny movements of her brow or eyes that spoke louder than words. And he knew she was afraid, not for herself, but for both of their people, because this was the moment everything would change. And Jonas kept wondering what would happen when they arrived, if Earth's defenses would open fire before they had a chance to explain, if his old commander Lyra Sol would believe him, or if the silence would reach Earth before the truth did. And as they dropped out of jump near Neptune's orbit, alarms immediately flared across every system. The stealth ship was detected, tagged, locked by planetary defense systems, and a warning hailed them in harsh tones, demanding surrender, calling Jonas by name, accusing him of treason. And Sarai told him they didn't have time to argue, that the Vorin was only hours behind. And Jonas opened a channel, shouting over the interference that this was not an attack, but a warning, that they had evidence that Earth was in danger. And for a tense moment, there was no reply, just a quiet hum of targeting systems locking on. And then a voice came through Lyra's voice, calm but cold, telling Jonas to power down, to prepare for a rest. But he could hear the uncertainty in her tone, could hear that she hadn't made up her mind yet, and so he sent a data burst, compressed memory visions pulled from Sarai's mind, including the mind-stream images Jonas himself had witnessed, the destruction of Celestine, the dark wounds left by the Vorin, the way entire systems had gone quiet in their wake. And he waited, breath held, while Lyra went silent. And minutes passed before she answered, voice low now, asking if what she saw was real. And Jonas simply said, "It's coming." And that was enough, 'cause the planetary defenses stood down, and 2 interceptors flanked their ship to escort them into orbit. And as Earth came into view, blue and white and full of life, Jonas felt a wave of dread, because this world, this home, had no idea how close it stood to the edge of silence. And when they landed on a secure deck in Luna Station, armed guards met them, but no shots were fired. And Sarai stepped forward without resistance, holding her hands out calmly as she was. Lead inside, and Jonas followed close, speaking to no one, his face tight with worry. And in a private chamber deep inside the station, he finally stood before the High Council. Faces he once trusted now filled with doubt and fear, and he explained everything, what he saw, what he felt, what Sarai had shown him, and Sarai, standing beside him, spoke softly but clearly, her words translated through neural interface, sharing pieces of her memory directly with those who listened, and even the most hardened council members went still as they saw the truth. The Vorin were not a myth, not a theory, but a force already moving, already close, and when Sarai said they would arrive within the week, no one spoke for a long time, and then the council erupted into panic, arguing, accusing, blaming, until Lyra silenced them, saying they had no time for politics, only decisions. And she looked to Jonas and Sarai, asking what could be done. And Sarai hesitated, then said the only hope was unity, combining the defense systems of both species into a single network, to create a net of silence, to hide Earth long enough to build a response. But the technology was Zowring and sharing. It would mean giving up secrets that had taken centuries to protect. And Jonah saw the strain on her face as she offered this sacrifice, knowing it would end her people's isolation forever. And the council turned to him, asking if it could be trusted, and Jonas, without doubt, said yes. And so they began the work, linking Earth's defense satellites with alien cloaking systems, modifying communications to operate through neural bursts instead of waves. And for 3 days, both humans and Zowran worked side by side under Jonas's command. The first time in history the two species cooperated without fear. And slowly, trust began to grow. But the Vorin were not waiting, and early on the 4th day, a signal flared near the edge of the system, a ripple in space that swallowed probes whole. And the warning came too late. Something massive had breached the void, heading straight for Earth, and chaos erupted as the cloaking net went live, hiding the planet in a veil of false stars and dead light. And for a few hours, the Vorin did not react, drifting slowly into the system, silent and vast. And Jonas watched from the command center, holding his breath as the shadow passed Jupiter, moving past Mars, gliding like a black tide. And then it stopped right near the Earth's Veyland for one long minute. No one moved, no one spoke, and then the silence struck, sending out a pulse that shattered 2 cloaked satellites, shaking the veil. And Jonas shouted orders as Sarai reached into the neural systems, feeding power from the Zowran mind cores directly into the net, stabilizing it at great cost. And the Vorin hovered, confused, as if uncertain where the world had gone. And then, finally, it began to withdraw, slowly at first, then with rising speed, fading into the stars again. And Jonas collapsed back in his seat, sweat on his brow, heart pounding, as Earth lived another day. And cheers erupted across Luna's station. But he did not join them, because he knew this was only a delay, not a victory. And later, in the quiet after, Sarai stood beside him on the observation deck, watching the stars. She asked what would happen next. Dea and Jonas said he didn't know, 'cause Earth might accept peace, or they might turn on her again. And Sarai said she was ready for either, because she had made her choice to protect all life, not just her own people. And then she looked at him, really looked at him, and said, "You must choose to." And Jonas, caught between 2 worlds, human and alien, soldier and rebel duty, and truth realized she was right, because if peace was going to last, someone had to stand between both sides, someone who had seen the enemy and survived. And though the stars still held their silence, he knew that tomorrow would bring a choice he could no longer avoid. The stars shimmered beyond the glass of the observation deck, cold and distant, as Jonas Vierick stood alone, his reflection staring back at him like a question with no answer. And the silence in the room pressed around him, heavy with decisions not yet made, because the warning had been delivered. The Vorin had seen Earth and turned away for now, but everyone knew it would not last. And behind the smiles and official speeches, behind the sudden alliance of humans and Zowran, a deeper fear stirred, the kind that ate at trust and made people forget who saved them in the first place. And Jonas had already heard the whispers in the corridors of Luna Station. Distrust of the Zauren, suspicion of Sarai, questions about Jonas's loyalty. And now that the danger had passed, old divisions were rising again, louder each day. And Lyra Soul had called him in that morning, her voice tight, warning him that factions in the Earth Council wanted Sarai detained, questioned, maybe even used to reverse engineer Zauren technology. And Jonas had seen the look in her eyes. The same look she gave before a battlefield decision she knew would cost lives. And he knew then that Sarai was in danger, not from the Vorin, but from the very people she had helped protect. And when he went to find her, he discovered she had already left her secure quarters, gone silent on every internal sensor, and he understood immediately. She knew. She had seen it coming, and she was running, not to hide, but to finish what she started. To find the final piece of hope hidden beyond the veil of known space. Because long ago, in the mind stream, Sarai had seen something not even her own people believed a Vorin that had stopped, not because of fear, but because of a signal, sound deep within its core that had changed it. And she believed it was not a weapon, but a message, an old one, possibly from a species even older than the Vorin. One that had once faced the silence and survived. And Jonas, heart pounding, raced back to the hangar, calling in every favor, bypassing every protocol, stealing a scout vessel designed for rapid jumps. And as alarms sounded and lockdown warnings filled the air, he launched into the stars, chasing a ghost, chasing her, because he had made his choice, and he would not let her walk into the unknown alone. Not again. And the journey took him through dead systems, across radiation scars, into dust fields, where light bent and signals died. But he followed the faint trace Sarai left. Behind neural echoes in the black hand, each jump brought flashes of memory, not his own. Pieces of her thoughts, broadcast like breadcrumbs, showing him where she went, what she saw. And he began to feel her in his mind again, not fully, but enough to understand that she was close to something, that she was afraid, not of death, but of what she might find. Because if she was right, if the Vorin could be changed, then the galaxy had a future. But if she was wrong, then Earth's survival was only a delay, not a salvation. And when Jonas reached the final coordinates, found her ship drifting in orbit around a dead planet, its surface cracked like old glass, its sky full of red dust storms. And inside the ruins of an ancient alien city, he found her standing at the center of a strange stone circle, surrounded by silent machines that still hummed with life. And she turned slowly as he approached, her eyes tired but bright, and she said softly, "It's still here." And as she reached out to touch a pulsing stone at the circle's heart, the machines came alive, casting light across the broken sky. And Jonas saw its images, not in his eyes, but in his mental memory of the Vorin, not as monsters, but as something lost, drifting, called into the void by a song they had forgotten how to sing. And in that moment, he understood. The Vorin were not destroyers by nature, but tools abandoned by their makers, left to wander in a race without knowing why. And the message Sarai had found was not a weapon. Key, one that could awaken the silent minds of the Vorin and return them to what they once were. And as the light spread across the stone circle, reaching into the stars, Jonas knew they had no choice but to use it, to broadcast it through every signal, to let the Vorin hear their own name again. And Sarai looked at him, her face soft, and asked, "Do you trust me?" And Jonas, without hesitation, took her hand and said, "Yes." And they activated the pulse, sending the ancient signal into the void, knowing it could take hours, days, or even minutes. And they waited in silence, watching the stars. And when the Vorin came again, it did not attack, it stopped, hovered, and for the first time it responded, not with silence, but with a hum, low and steady, like a song remembered. And Sarai fell to her knees. tears in her eyes as she whispered, "It worked," and Jonas stood beside her, filled with something he hadn't felt in years. Not fear, not sorrow, but hope, real and alive, as the Vorin turned and vanished into the deep. Not as hunters, but as something else, something new. And when they returned to Earth weeks later, there were no handcuffs waiting, no guns, only silence. And then cheers, and then questions, because the world had changed, and for the first time, the galaxy stood at the edge of something bright, not because of weapons or war, but because, two enemies had chosen to trust, and Jonas, once a soldier, once a traitor, now stood not between two worlds, but as a bridge between them, and Sarai stood beside him, not as a queen, not as an alien, but as a face of hope. And together, they watched the stars, not in fear, but in wonder.